Welcome to Cyber AI. This is an introductory lecture where we're going to be talking about the intersection of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Some of our goals include discussing the principles of cybersecurity and discussing how artificial intelligence and cybersecurity intersect. Well, this course matters a lot in today's world, especially if you're in cybersecurity directly working on that, because we're going to be using, and we are using, AI to detect anomalies and threats and then automating some of the cybersecurity attacks. There are so many threats and attacks that are out there that are occurring all the time. Attempted attacks, port scans, from the very simplest to more targeted attacks, and it's impossible because a lot of that just creates noise. They aren't really serious attacks, but they are happening anyway, and we can use AI to help discern between the more serious targeted attacks and just those drive-by port scan type things that are relatively harmless. We're also going to be talking in this course about how to build and evaluate AI-enabled tools. So let's start off with a focus on cybersecurity and give you a little bit of background on cybersecurity itself. The goal with cybersecurity is to protect networks, systems, and data from digital attacks. We have a focus on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and we'll talk more in depth about those. Those are very central to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, of course, impacts every industry today that we encounter. The four pillars of cybersecurity: prevention, detection, response, and recovery. Prevention is where we're really talking about blocking threats before they cause harm. And detection is identifying those breaches, identifying the attacks, and identifying any unusual behavior and identifying anomalies. Response and recovery, we're talking about containing incidents. So if something does happen, we want to limit the damage from it and then restore operations as soon as we can. And that connects directly to that CIA triad that we were talking about before: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is where we're really simple. Just keep private things private. Keep data private. The things that we don't want others to see or that they aren't authorized to see, we're trying to keep that private. Integrity is a little bit more nuanced, but it's keeping data accurate and untampered. And then availability is ensuring that systems are always accessible. We always want to be able to access our systems when we want to. That's availability. And you can think about that in broader terms: availability of, well, just about anything that would affect the ability to use a system. Think about if the classroom is locked, you can't get into the classroom to use the computers inside of it. And the same way with a denial of service attack from a digital side. If someone prevents me from using a server that I want to get access to, well, that's the same thing. It affects availability. So let's look more at confidentiality. We'll circle back around to availability in a few moments. But the real world side of confidentiality, an email leak, that would be breaching confidentiality. Even things like CCing the wrong person on a confidential email would be considered a breach of confidentiality. We can remediate that with encryption, with access controls, virtual private networks, or VPNs. Those types of things will help us maintain confidentiality because the content, the data, is encrypted, or someone is prevented from getting access to it with those access controls. Integrity, as I said, was a little bit more nuanced. Changing the contents of a software repository without detection would be an example of breaching integrity. If I'm able to get access to your software and then it is distributed with my code in it, malicious code, then that would breach integrity of that software. The software is no longer considered to have full integrity on it because we can't verify that what's been changed inside of it. And we can remediate that with hashing digital signatures, checksums. So simply taking a checksum of a file at one time and then checksumming that file again and seeing if it's changed. We can know then that that the file is changed. And rootkits or attacks that attack servers often will be able to remediate that by just simply checking the checksums of files to see if they've changed. And yes, there are checksum collisions, and attackers have been known to. There are attacks where people will make sure that the checksum is the same, even though the file contains their malicious code. So that definitely does occur, but generally speaking, we can use checksums as a data point if we think something has been broken into. And so we're trying to detect the unauthorized changes to data. Sometimes it's through programs that we're trying to detect as well to see if someone has broken into a server, for example, and taken it over. I talked a little bit about availability already. So denial of service attack, we can remediate that with some DDoS protection, or simply splitting servers up, blocking IP addresses that are doing it. Of course, if it's a DDoS or a distributed denial of service, then it's a little harder to block IPs individually. It becomes sort of like a whack-a-mole game where you're blocking IPs while that attack is going on. It gets a little bit difficult to do that. But the goal is to keep services running during attacks. So even if we are under attack, or if there is a failure, let's say a natural disaster or something like that, we want to keep the systems running. We want to keep that data available. So Netflix is a good example there. They have servers all over the world, and if one data center goes down, they're able to continue as if nothing happened. So that hospital scenario was right there, right? If we're thinking of confidentiality, integrity, availability in the real world with a hospital, well, confidentiality is simple. It's patient records, keeping those patient records confidential. Integrity is lab results. If I can get access somehow to the systems and change those lab results, well, that can be obviously life-changing for someone to change a diagnosis, change a 0 to a 1 somewhere. And it is obviously life impacting. Even if I can't see the data, that's the important difference here. Even if I can't see what I'm changing as an attacker, if I know that there are lab results here and I want to slightly mess with them, I'm not able to see them, but I have the ability to write to them instead of read them, then I can violate that integrity of the CIA triad. And of course, availability, making sure that things are up 24/7 at a hospital, is definitely vital. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. The three key terms that we would think of with those: a threat is a potential cause of harm. A vulnerability is a weakness that we find in the system, and an exploit is a technique to take advantage of a vulnerability. So those three key terms: threat, vulnerability, and exploit. There's a difference between all three. And it's important in cybersecurity to understand all three, because that's how we get to considering risk. And we look at risk often in cybersecurity. One way to look at that risk is to calculate it. Simply the threat multiplied by the vulnerability multiplied by the impact, or additive, however you want to look at that calculation. So we're going to prioritize that risk based on the likelihood and severity. And we have limited resources. That's why we need to prioritize that risk. So a great example is a meteor strike, right? We could have a meteor strike, a meteor shower could happen, and one of those things could hit a data center that we have locally. Well, what's the likelihood of that event happening? Well, the likelihood is fairly low. It's non-zero, of course, but it's fairly low. And what's the impact of that? Well, if it's a big meteor, it could knock out the entire data center. So how do we mitigate that risk? Well, let's see. We would create another data center somewhere far, far away, hopefully far enough away from that meteor strike that it wouldn't affect our data or our availability. And so that's something to think about. Now, if we take that a little bit smaller scale, think about something more realistic, someone breaking into the data center, well, there's a risk of that happening, right? There's a risk of that occurring, and now what's the likelihood of that occurring? Well, it's a little bit higher than a meteor strike, probably. And if we look at that risk or that likelihood, and then we also look at impact, if they got into there, well, they could do a lot of damage. They could affect confidentiality, they could affect integrity, and obviously availability if they were able to break into the data center. So how do we mitigate that? Well, we put locks on the doors is one way to mitigate that threat. We could put cameras up, of course, but cameras won't necessarily mitigate the threat or the vulnerability there, because they're not going to be something that we're monitoring. If we're not monitoring the cameras, actively monitoring the cameras, and the security guard doesn't fall asleep, etc., then maybe it's a mitigation if we're watching those cameras 24/7. But if we're only using those cameras to track who went in and out, or as a recovery mechanism to find out what they look like and get a description of them and find them, well, that still doesn't mitigate the threat or the vulnerability within that system. And so we have to consider what cameras do. Well, we could place a security guard out there, but now what about getting around that security guard? We've all seen Mission Impossible or similar movies, and we know that there are ways to get around that. Come in through the roof. Don't go in through the front door. Don't go in through the door where the security guard is standing. You go around it, right? And so we have to think about that. Now, of course, a security guard, paying a security guard is much more expensive than installing cameras, much more expensive than installing locks, because we have to have more than one security guard. They can't work 24/7. And so it gets more and more expensive to guard those things in a way that actually matters. So we have to prioritize that because we do have limited resources. Let's look at a different example around risk, and that's the Heartbleed exploit, and I've included a link here. You can read about the Heartbleed exploit that happened several years ago. It was a vulnerability in the SSL library, so think HTTPS. When you go to a website, https:// it was a vulnerability in the library that provided that encryption, and it allowed attackers to read server memory by accessing the site from a remote location. They didn't have to have insider access or anything like that. They could simply exploit that from a remote location. It affected millions of sites. It was a drop everything and fix this type of vulnerability. And I remember I was working in industry at the time when Heartbleed came out, and it was a all hands on deck thing, where even I, at the time was a technical architect, was pulled in to help with the server side of that because I had some server and load balancer experience. And so I was pulled in to assist with the mitigation and the efforts around that vulnerability and figuring out if we were impacted. And then when we figured out, yes, we are impacted, how do we fix this soonest? How do we limit the damage, etc.? So all of those things happened. It was fairly serious, and that is a risk. And we didn't really have that on our radar at all as being, so there's going to be something catastrophically wrong with the SSL library. And so now suddenly we have to fix that on an emergency basis. You can't always figure those things out ahead of time, and sometimes you just need to react. So let's switch gears once again and look at the types of threat actors that we have. Three types that you might consider, and there we can subtype this all we want and go a little bit deeper, but when you're really looking at it, you're thinking of script kiddies or low-skill individuals. They're using pre-built tools. Maybe it's a bot network that's just port scanning every IP on the internet to look for certain ports that are open. And those are relatively harmless. However, if you are targeted for an attack, or let's say that the bot that they have that's port scanning suddenly finds whatever port it is that they have an exploit for. Let's say they find an exploit in remote desktop protocol for Windows, and they know that they can access it if they find that port open on your IP. Well, then suddenly they're able to target you and try to run their exploit on your remote desktop installation. And that's a real world thing that does happen. So script kiddies, they're low skill individuals, but that doesn't mean that they can't do some damage if they find that there's something wrong that they're interested in. A level up from a script kiddie would be a hacktivist, or somebody that's politically or socially motivated. So they're motivated to target you specifically or your type of organization. And so they're going to be looking specifically at you. They're not just port scanning all IPs, they're looking specifically for your type of organization, or maybe your organization. Some organizations get enemies just by nature of what they do or who they are, and hacktivists will attempt to break into them often. And then a level significantly above hacktivists would be a nation state or advanced persistent threat type of group. These are highly skilled and well-funded adversaries that we have to be concerned about significantly when we're working with or considering the types of threat actors that we have. Because they're persistent, and one of the characteristics is that they will keep attempting to break in, and they also, importantly, do not have to worry about legal ramifications because they're sponsored by a nation state. So they don't have to worry about any of the legal implications of attacking a system in another country, whatever their target is. And that's an important differentiation between them and, say, a hacktivist or a script kiddie. One other type of individual that we really didn't talk about yet is an insider threat, someone that is either malicious or negligent insiders, someone who has intent, who has access to break in or to steal information, and they have the ability to do that. That's a classic malicious insider threat. And we really can't do much about that. It's one of the hardest things that we can detect because they already have access. They're authorized to access, let's say it's personal health information or credit card data, and somehow we have that in a way that they can get access to it well before it's encrypted, if we're obviously encrypting that on the back end in the database. And they have access to get that information before it is encrypted. Well, there's really not a lot we can do about that. We can't detect it. One of the things that we will tend to do is log who is accessing what time they're accessing something, when they're accessing it. We might take it to the next level, and any time that someone logs into a certain system, an alert is sent. That's often done for the aforementioned credit card type systems. We'll send an alert because someone logged into it, and they need to have a reason to have logged into it. Maybe there's a help desk ticket, maybe they're doing something else, but there needed to have been a reason for them to log in. And even often we'll have an approval chain. Before you can log into this system, you need to get manager approval. So there's another person involved in that access that authorizes the access ahead of time. That is something that will happen as well. But an audit chain, again, it won't prevent someone from doing something that they shouldn't. However, we can significantly control that behavior. And we can also audit what someone is doing. We can watch their mouse clicks. We can also record what commands they're running. If it's, let's say, they're SSH'd in on a Linux machine, we can be recording the commands that they run, when they run them, etc., and making sure that they're not doing anything they shouldn't. Negligent insiders are the classic HR people who click on emails all the time, or the social media people who keep just clicking on things and bringing viruses and other problems into the organization. Those happen very often. They're easier to detect because we try to guard against it. We know that those types of folks will have problems controlling themselves before they click, or reading things before they click. Classic HR folks. And so they'll end up clicking on something, and then it'll exploit their machine, or it'll go onto the network and encrypt things. Those are absolute attacks that happen daily now, unfortunately, and we try to guard against those as best we can. Let's take a look at a case study, a couple of case studies actually. Let's start with Sony Pictures. Sony a while ago had some state-sponsored retaliation for a movie that they released. So there was an attack. It was we believe to be, or what is believed to be, a nation-state sponsored attack that ended up getting internal emails and some unreleased films. All of those got released because they were attacked. They were targeted specifically for that attack, what is believed to have been a nation state. And it caused some brand and financial damage for Sony Pictures as a result. Another case study that's out there also is Target Corporation. There was a third-party HVAC vendor who had a breach that came through that HVAC vendor, and the attacker was able to steal payment card data, and it cost the company over $200 million to recover from that. One other case study, Stuxnet worm, was designed to sabotage nuclear centrifuges in Iran, multiple 0 days, USB propagation, so malware that was installed on USB drives, and when plugged in automatically propagated itself. And 0 days, by the way, we haven't talked about yet. A 0 day is an exploit that's considered to be just released or new or unknown. And so the chances of that exploit being successful are high because it hasn't even been released, might not have been, often not released to the vendor or the company that is responsible for that software. So a Microsoft 0 day would be something that Microsoft doesn't even know about yet, but as an attacker you can exploit it and take advantage of whatever that vulnerability does. And so that's what a 0 day exploit would be called. And the Stuxnet worm used multiple 0 day exploits. And it was the cause of some physical destruction, that cyber weapon, the Stuxnet worm. So let's switch gears again and talk about the cyber kill chain. That is something developed by Lockheed Martin to analyze attacker behavior. Within that cyber kill chain, there's several steps. The first one is reconnaissance, where we're just learning about the target, or the attacker is just learning about the target. Once they learn about the target, then they're going to weaponize that. They're going to figure out, what can I exploit about this target, and what types of exploits do I have available? What types of things are they running? And then once I've figured that out, then I can switch gears over to delivery of that, deliver that exploit, or in other words, start the attack would be the delivery phase, and melded with the exploitation phase, and then installing whatever malware that I have within there. Once I've installed that malware, then C2, or command and control, is next. I now have access to your network, would be what would happen during that phase, and I'm able to move around within your network as I need to, as an attacker here. And then, of course, undertaking whatever actions that I have. So those steps are involved, were common and developed by Lockheed Martin, observed by Lockheed Martin, and it helps to analyze what an attacker is doing. That recon phase could be as simple as a port scan. Or it could be learning about the structure of the email addresses in your company and targeting individuals who are likely to click on emails. I pick on HR folks, but finance folks are also guilty of it. You can make an email, forge an email that looks like it came from the CEO. Hey, click on this. I need this spreadsheet immediately. That level of urgency that's often in phishing emails. And so that's the weaponization, reconnaissance phase, and then that turns into weaponization, sending that email, and then exploiting that. Whatever script was in that email to run would be installed, and then that gives the attacker some leverage into the network, and they can undertake whatever actions that they want. So the way to mitigate that, and one of the common themes that we have within cybersecurity, is the concept of defense in depth, where we have multiple security controls and we layer them one on top of or around one another. And that gives us the ability to, if an attack does occur, to limit the damage or to mitigate the amount of damage. And so we might do that by segregating servers from client machines. In other words, our desktop and laptop machines don't have access or all full access to the servers. And the servers likewise have very limited access, let's say, to a database server between a web server. We limit that access. So if someone does break into the web server, they're not able to leverage themselves onto our desktops, and they're not able to leverage themselves onto the database server or jump over to the database server because we've limited access. And we've also installed something like an intrusion detection system. So we know suddenly that someone, for whatever reason, there's a port scan that started from our web server. Why is the web server scanning ports or attempting to scan ports on our internal network? And then we can take action to mitigate that. That's part of defense in depth. We can stop that activity, detect it, and stop that activity because we have multiple levels of detection. We have that defense in depth concept. Tied into defense in depth is endpoint security. Think about endpoints as being the devices that you're using. So laptop, desktop, phone. I was going to say telephone, but cell phone, your smartphone, tablets, anything that is we would consider to be where communications start or end might be considered an endpoint. We'll often install antivirus on those and some endpoint detection and response to know when other software is running that shouldn't be, which is directly related to device hardening. Disabling unused ports is one of the ways that we can harden an endpoint, especially servers. We'll disable software that would open up ports and possibly be exploited there. Policy enforcement is an important part of cybersecurity as well. Mobile device management, being able to push profiles out to mobile devices, limiting the software that can be executed on a machine. So a university machine would be a great example of that, or an enterprise machine where you can't install software. You don't have administrator privileges. Only certain software is allowed to be executed on those endpoints. One thing to be aware of around endpoint security, though, is security theater. And security theater really refers to solutions that don't add value. It's a solution in search of a problem often. And the one that I often will use as an example is antivirus on a Linux machine. It makes no sense and takes up significant resources for Linux servers. Intrusion detection is different than antivirus. I'm talking full-on antivirus looking for viruses that would only affect desktop machines. And I've seen that installed often on where we're doing checkbox compliance or where we're doing things just simply to make someone happy that all endpoints have antivirus on them, even though it literally makes no sense and in fact will contribute to denial of service or in itself be an exploit. I've seen antivirus on Linux be an exploit or a path to an attack more often than I've seen it help, when actually never seen it help. So it's not hard to meet that bar or that criteria. So that's an example of security theater where we're solving something that isn't actually a risk. It'd be like building something that is entirely meteor strike proof because the likelihood of that isn't very high. It's non-zero. It's always non-zero, but the likelihood of that, build a meteor-proof data center, but put no locks and no cameras on it, right? Anyone can get in anytime. That's roughly what we're doing with antivirus on some of these endpoints. Application security. If you're a developer, your code matters. So looking at secure coding principles, code review principles, we can use AI for some of that. But remember, AI is only going to be as smart as the input. So if all of the input to an AI model has the same security vulnerability or is unable to discern secure from non-secure code, well, then we really haven't gotten anywhere. So relying on AI entirely for that until we know that the AI is specifically trained to look for security issues, well, then it's a little bit of a problem. OWASP, I have included a link to the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities here. That's something to look through. DevSecOps principles are also great here. Just the overall general idea for DevOps and DevSecOps, helping to automate security things and to move those security requirements and security mindset towards the developers, shifting those left, or you might hear the term shift left, meaning that we're trying to move some of those things and make them more automated so developers don't have to even think about them. They're just inherent in the systems that are being developed. And I'm going to stop there for now. There is, of course, much more to talk about with cybersecurity and AI, and a future video will continue the discussion. For now, hopefully you've learned that cybersecurity is a complex, multi-layered discipline. Recall the CIA triad that we talked about: confidentiality, integrity, availability. We also talked about the importance of defense in depth. And we've talked a little bit about AI and how we can use that in cybersecurity to reduce some of the mundane tasks. But there are also some limitations around AI and cybersecurity. So thanks for watching this video. Look for a future video to continue our discussion of cybersecurity.